Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel where we learn to be a better programmer. This is the fourth video of my Java video tutorial, and today we're going to talk about data types and variables. In the first video of this tutorial, I discussed how Java isn't a pure object-oriented programming language because it provides primitive data types. I've listed the primitive data types here on the screen and their associated values that they can hold. So bytes can hold this range of values, a long can hold this range of values, and so on. So what do we mean by primitive? Primitive simply means that it's just a value that we can't call methods on, for example. So if I try to say along dot something, try to call a function or try to do something on it, I can't because it's a primitive value. It's not an object. So the developers of Java gave us a tool that we can use to wrap these primitive data types in objects and perform some sort of operations on them. So for example, if I were to take this, if I wanted an object version of a long value, I could just say my long is equal to 4, with an L at the end and a semicolon. So the reason why we have to put an L at the end is to signify and tell the compiler to treat this value as a long. By default in Java, integral values are treated as integers by default. So if you want this to be treated as a long value, then you need to provide this suffix. Similarly, if I were to say I want a float value, so my float, I would have to say 4.0, and as you can see, there's a red squiggly line here because it defaults to a double value. As it says, I provided a double but required a float. So I would just have to put an F on the end of that to tell it as a float. So now that I have object representations of these values, I can say my float dot. So I can convert it to a byte, I can compare it to another float, I can convert it to a double, I can compare it to another object and see if they're equal. I can convert it to a float value, like the primitive float value. I can convert it to an int value, and there's all these other methods that I can call on this my float object, which we couldn't do with the primitive data type. Variables are how we store and modify information within our Java programs. So variables can be declared, and here's an example of a declaration. So when we declare a variable, we set the type and then the name followed by a semicolon. So what this means is that we have said that our program is going to allocate some memory that is of size integer and assign it, or give it the variable name myInt. So by default, this variable is null. So when you run your program and try to access some methods on this integer value, then you will get what is called a null pointer exception, and we'll go over that in our exceptions lecture. So next, you can also declare and assign a variable at the same time. This is called initialization. So when we initialize a variable, that means we declare it for the first time. So we say integer my second int is equal to 1. So we declare, we say create this, and then when you create it, assign the variable 1 to that object. So there are a lot of modifier keywords that you can use on variables to create different types of functionality. So for example, one such keyword is called static. So static keyword means that there is only one copy of this variable across all of the classes and instances of variables. So if I were to create 10 instances of variables, they would all share one copy of my double. So if one instance of variables made a change to my double, say changed it to 13, then all the instances would have that value of 13. Okay. Final is similar to JavaScript and const means that we can't modify this value. So this is a value that can't be modified inside of the variables class, or for anywhere for that matter. Okay, so those are what we call non-access modifier keywords. So what we're going to talk about now is access modifiers. So access modifiers provide protection against modifying variables unintentionally. So for example, if I don't care who has access to a variable, then I would just make it public. That means any class from any package can access this value integer of 19. Okay? Private, on the other hand, means that only instances of the variable class can access it. So that means that this float value can only be modified by instances of the variable's class. Okay? Protected means that only classes and objects inside of the variable's package up here have access to that value. Also, subclasses of the variables class can have access to this value as well. So don't worry too much about subclasses. We'll go over that when we go over classes and inheritance. Also, one last thing, by default, if we don't provide an access modifier to a variable, it is package private. That just means that any class inside of the variables package can access this value here, for example. So that's all you need to know about variables. In the next video, we're going to go over scope and arithmetic operations. So now that we can create variables, how do we modify them? Can we perform addition, subtraction, multiplication, division? Can we do modulo operators? So this way we're getting into how do we mutate these values and use them in our programs. Okay, that's all I have for you today. And if you like the video, please feel to like and subscribe and wait for the next part. All right, thanks so much.